He's stealing. The CEO's voice cracked through the gleaming lobby like a fire alarm, sharp enough to stop every conversation, every footstep, every elevator door halfway through closing. Heads turned in perfect unison toward the man standing quietly near the reception desk. A tall black man wearing a faded work jacket, worn brown boots, and a small weathered metal box held carefully against his chest as though it contained something too precious to risk dropping. Security officers hurried across the polished marble floor, their reflections stretching beneath the crystal lights overhead while whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone reached for a phone. Another employee stepped backward. A visitor quietly moved aside, unwilling to be caught in whatever was about to happen. Marcus Bennett neither raised his voice nor argued. He simply looked toward the executive standing above the staircase. Richard Callaway, the celebrated CEO of Callaway Technologies, had built his reputation on confidence that bordered on certainty. Every business magazine praised his instincts. Every television interview described him as a man who could read people within seconds. Now those same instincts convinced him that the stranger in his lobby did not belong. "I saw him coming out of the private hallway," Richard declared, his expensive navy suit catching the morning sunlight pouring through the 30-foot glass windows. "Nobody carrying company property leaves through that corridor. Stop him before he disappears." The security team formed a respectful circle around Marcus, careful but unmistakably suspicious. One officer extended an open hand. "Sir, would you mind setting the box on the counter?" Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Of course." His voice remained calm, low, almost gentle. He walked slowly to the reception desk and placed the old metal box on the polished granite surface. It made a soft metallic click, surprisingly light for something that had commanded so much attention. The receptionist stared at it without blinking. Richard descended the staircase one measured step at a time, his polished shoes echoing across the silent lobby. Hundreds of employees had gathered around the balconies overlooking the atrium. The building, usually alive with ringing phones and hurried conversations, now felt suspended in a strange stillness. Richard stopped only a few feet from Marcus. "Who gave you access to this building?" he demanded. Marcus met his eyes respectfully. "I came because I promised someone I would." Richard frowned. "That isn't an answer." Marcus offered a faint smile that carried neither fear nor resentment. "It's the only truthful one." The answer drew confused glances from everyone listening. Richard folded his arms. "Open the box." Marcus rested one hand lightly on its weathered lid. Tiny scratches crossed the faded steel, each mark hinting at years of careful use. He looked down for a brief moment before lifting his eyes again. "I will," he said quietly. "But before I do, there's something you deserve to know." Richard shook his head immediately. No speeches. No excuses. Marcus did not react to the interruption. He simply stood with the same steady posture, sunlight tracing the edges of his face while the silence inside the lobby grew heavier with every passing second. Somewhere above them, the American flag hanging beside the company crest moved gently in the cool air from the ventilation system. Even that quiet flutter seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Marcus glanced once at the metal box, then back at the CEO whose certainty had already condemned him without a single question. "Everything inside belongs to your family," he said softly. "I've spent 20 years making sure it reached the right hands." No one moved. The silence inside the lobby lingered so long that even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Richard Callaway studied Marcus Bennett with narrowed eyes, searching for the confidence of a con artist or the nervousness of a man caught in a lie. Instead, he found neither. Marcus stood with relaxed shoulders and steady hands resting beside the old metal box. There was no anger in his face, no panic, only the calm patience of someone who had already waited a very long time. Richard glanced toward the head of security. "Did anyone verify his identification?" The officer shook his head. "Not yet, sir. He has been completely cooperative." Richard looked back at Marcus. "Then start talking. You said everything inside that box belongs to my family. How would you even know my family?" Marcus lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "Because your father trusted me when very few people did." A murmur swept across the gathered employees. Richard's expression hardened immediately. "My father passed away 20 years ago." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know." His quiet reply carried none of the hesitation everyone expected. It sounded like a memory rather than an argument. Richard folded his arms tighter across his chest. You expect everyone here to believe that my father handed valuable family belongings to someone no one has ever heard of? Marcus looked toward the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago, where the morning sunlight reflected across neighboring glass towers. Not valuable because of money, he answered softly. Valuable because of promises. The words settled over the room with surprising weight. Several employees exchanged uncertain looks. The receptionist who had first watched Marcus place the box on the counter now noticed how carefully he had protected it from every bump and every hurried movement. The faded steel was scratched by time, but the small brass latch had been polished clean countless times. It was obvious someone had treated it with extraordinary care. Richard noticed it too, although he refused to let curiosity replace suspicion. Who are you? He asked again. Marcus smiled faintly. A maintenance worker. A church volunteer. A neighbor. A man who kept his word. Richard let out a quiet breath through his nose, unconvinced. That still does not explain why you came here today. Marcus lifted one hand and gently brushed away a thin layer of dust resting near the edge of the box. Because today would have been your father's 78th birthday. Richard blinked once. His face remained controlled, but something behind his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. Very few people inside the company even remembered that date. Marcus continued before anyone interrupted. He told me that when this day finally arrived, you would either become the man he believed you could be or the man he feared you might become. He asked me not to judge. He asked me only to deliver what he left behind. The security officers no longer looked at Marcus with the same suspicion. Instead, they glanced toward Richard, waiting for his reaction. Richard remained perfectly still beneath the bright lobby lights, his confidence untouched on the surface. Yet somewhere beneath that polished exterior a single question had begun to grow. If this stranger truly knew his father, how had no one in the family ever spoken his name? Richard Calloway slowly reached toward the metal box, then stopped before his fingertips touched the worn brass latch. Something about it unsettled him. It was not fear of what might be inside. It was the realization that this ordinary-looking object had somehow crossed 2 decades untouched, carried by a man he had dismissed within seconds of seeing him. Around the lobby, no one spoke. The employees who had gathered along the balconies leaned forward against the glass railings, watching the exchange unfold beneath the towering skylight. The polished marble floor reflected every movement like a mirror, making the silence feel even larger. Richard drew a slow breath. If my father really trusted you, he said carefully, tell me something that no newspaper ever printed. Marcus did not answer immediately. His eyes wandered toward a bronze sculpture displayed near the entrance, one Richard had passed thousands of times without giving it a second glance. Your father hated that sculpture, Marcus said with a quiet smile. He always said it looked expensive but completely empty. Every Christmas, he joked that one day he would replace it with a wooden bench because people needed somewhere to sit more than they needed another piece of polished metal. Several longtime executives exchanged startled looks. Richard remembered those exact words. His father had repeated them every December until the year he passed away. Marcus continued before anyone interrupted. He kept peppermint candies in the right drawer of his desk because he believed nervous people deserved kindness before difficult conversations. He wrote thank you letters by hand every Friday afternoon. He knew the names of every janitor in this building before he knew the names of most investors. He once told me that respect was the only investment that always earned interest. Richard remained silent. Memories he had not visited in years returned with remarkable clarity. He could almost smell the peppermint candies his father always carried. He could hear the familiar laughter echoing through the old headquarters before the company became one of the largest technology firms in the country. Marcus looked down at the box once more. I met your father on a rainy Tuesday evening. My truck had broken down 3 blocks from the old office. I was trying to push it out of traffic when he stopped to help. Richard frowned slightly. He never mentioned that. Marcus nodded. He would not have. He never believed ordinary kindness deserved applause. A faint smile appeared on the face of an elderly receptionist who had worked for the company for more than 30 years. She whispered softly to the employee beside her. That sounds exactly like Mr. Calloway. Richard heard the words, although he pretended not to. The certainty that had filled him only minutes earlier now felt strangely fragile. His first impression of Marcus had been immediate, confident, and absolute. Yet every sentence this quiet stranger spoke sounded less like a performance and more like someone remembering a dear friend. Richard glanced toward the head of security. "Run a background check on Marcus Bennett." Marcus gently raised one hand. "You are welcome to check anything you wish. You will find parking tickets, volunteer records, maintenance jobs, and a life that has never been particularly remarkable. What you will not find is the promise I made your father, because some promises exist only between two people." Richard looked directly into Marcus's eyes for the first time without suspicion clouding his judgment. The lobby remained completely still as his hand finally settled on the cold brass latch, realizing that whatever waited inside the old metal box might change far more than the rest of his morning. Richard's fingers rested on the brass latch for several long seconds before he finally lifted it. The tiny click echoed through the lobby with surprising clarity. Every eye followed the movement. There was no stack of cash, no company files, no expensive jewelry. Inside the weathered metal box rested only 3 carefully wrapped items protected by a neatly folded white cloth that had yellowed slightly with age. On top lay an old silver pocket watch, polished until it reflected the sunlight pouring through the towering windows. Beside it rested a sealed envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. The final item was a small black and white photograph tucked inside a simple leather sleeve. Richard stared without speaking. Marcus remained where he was, giving the CEO complete space to see everything with his own eyes. "That watch belonged to your grandfather," Marcus said quietly. "Your father carried it every day until the spring he became ill. The envelope has never been opened since the afternoon he sealed it himself. The photograph was taken long before your company became famous." Richard slowly picked up the photograph. His breath caught almost instantly. The younger version of his father stood beside an old pickup truck with his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, smiling broadly with one arm around another young man covered in grease from repairing an engine. Richard looked from the picture to Marcus. The smile was unmistakable. The younger man in the photograph was him. Several long-time employees leaned closer, unable to hide their curiosity. Richard turned the photograph over. Written neatly across the back were a date from more than 20 years earlier and a short sentence in his father's familiar handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that good people are often overlooked." Richard traced the faded ink with one thumb. There was no doubt. Every letter matched birthday cards and personal notes he had kept for decades. His heartbeat slowed as memories returned in fragments. His father often disappeared for hours without explaining where he had gone. Sometimes he came home wearing dusty boots instead of polished dress shoes. Whenever Richard asked why, his father always answered with the same sentence. "Business tells you what people build. The streets tell you who they are." Marcus gently folded his hands in front of him. "Your father believed titles could introduce a person, but character was the only thing that could truly identify one." Richard remained silent. His confident posture softened almost without notice. He looked at the unopened envelope resting inside the box. The paper had aged, but the red wax seal remained perfectly intact. His own name appeared across the front in careful script. "Richard Calloway. Open only when your heart is ready to listen before it judges." A quiet gasp escaped someone standing near the reception desk. Even the security officers who had surrounded Marcus only minutes earlier had stepped back, no longer seeing him as a stranger who did not belong. Instead, they watched him with growing respect. Richard looked up slowly. "Why did you wait all these years?" Marcus answered with the same calm voice he had carried since entering the building. "Because I gave my word. Your father did not ask me to deliver this after he passed away. He asked me to wait until this exact birthday. He believed time would teach lessons that success never could. I honored his request, even when it meant carrying this box through 20 birthdays, 20 winters, and 20 springs." Richard lowered his eyes to the envelope again. For the first time that morning, the polished lobby no longer felt like his kingdom. It felt like a place where he had just begun to understand how quickly appearances could deceive, and how easily a stranger could carry the greatest truth he had never expected to hear. Richard carefully lifted the envelope from the metal box as though the paper itself might crumble beneath his fingers. The wax seal remained perfectly preserved, its deep crimson color softened only by time. Every person in the lobby watched without making a sound. Even the electronic display behind the reception desk seemed strangely unimportant compared to the quiet moment unfolding beneath the morning light. Richard turned the envelope over once more before looking at Marcus. "You never opened it?" he asked. Marcus slowly shook his head. "I gave my word. Some promises become heavier with every passing year, but they do not become optional." Richard lowered his eyes. He thought about the countless agreements he had signed throughout his career, contracts measured in millions of dollars, each one negotiated by attorneys and protected by teams of advisors. Yet none of them had lasted as long as the simple promise standing before him. With careful hands, he broke the wax seal. The crisp sound echoed gently across the silent atrium. Inside rested several neatly folded pages written in dark blue ink. Richard recognized his father's handwriting immediately. He swallowed quietly before reading the first line. "My dear son, if this letter has reached your hands, then the man standing before you has already succeeded where I hoped I would never fail." Richard paused. His breathing became slower. He continued reading. "Marcus Bennett is one of the finest men I have ever known. If you meet him with kindness, you will already be the leader I prayed you would become. If you meet him with suspicion, then this letter has arrived because your success has begun to hide your heart from you." Richard's fingers tightened slightly around the pages. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, yet the words made the crowded lobby disappear. The only voices that seemed to exist belonged to his father and the quiet man waiting patiently only a few feet away. The letter continued. 20 years ago, my car failed on a rainy evening after a board meeting. I was frustrated, tired, and ready to blame the world for my inconvenience. Marcus stopped to help without asking who I was. He refused every dollar I offered because he believed helping another person should never require a price. That night, I learned something no business school had ever taught me. Character often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. Richard closed his eyes for only a moment. Memories he had almost forgotten returned with remarkable clarity. His father had come home soaked by rain that evening, smiling more than usual, telling everyone at dinner that the best investment he had made all week had cost nothing at all. Richard had never understood what he meant. Now, after 2 decades, the missing piece finally rested in his hands. He slowly looked up at Marcus. The quiet maintenance worker had not moved since the letter was opened. There was no satisfaction on his face, no desire to prove anyone wrong, only peaceful patience. Richard realized that the greatest difference between them was not wealth, education, or status. It was that Marcus had spent 20 years protecting another man's trust, while Richard had judged a stranger within 20 seconds of seeing him. The realization settled over him with unmistakable weight. Around the lobby, employees lowered their eyes, sensing that they were witnessing something far greater than a business interruption. They were watching a lifetime of assumptions begin to unravel beneath the calm truth carried by one man who had simply refused to break his word. The letter slipped slightly in Richard's hands as he reached the final page. The bustling headquarters that usually pulsed with ringing telephones, quiet meetings, and hurried footsteps now rested in complete stillness. Sunlight continued drifting across the polished marble floor, climbing slowly toward the reception desk as the morning moved forward, yet no one seemed aware that time was passing. Richard lowered the pages carefully onto the counter and looked at Marcus with eyes that no longer carried certainty, only reflection. Marcus remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, standing with quiet dignity, never asking for recognition and never defending himself beyond the simple truth. He had spent 2 decades carrying another man's trust, and now that responsibility had finally reached its destination. Richard's voice came slowly, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "My father wrote that you visited him every month after he retired." Marcus nodded. He enjoyed talking more than fixing anything by then. We would drink coffee on his porch, watch the neighborhood children ride their bicycles, and he would tell me stories about building this company one customer at a time. Richard felt another memory surface. As a teenager, he had often skipped those weekend visits, believing business, conferences, and networking events mattered more than quiet afternoons with his father. He had assumed there would always be another Saturday. There never was. Marcus gently picked up the folded white cloth from inside the box and placed it beside the pocket watch. He also asked me for one more favor. Richard looked up. "What favor?" Marcus smiled softly. He said that if the day ever came when you judged me before knowing me, I was not to become angry. He said your world would teach you to trust appearances because appearances were faster than patience. He hoped one day you would discover the difference on your own. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The words settled deeply because they described exactly what had happened less than an hour earlier. He had seen worn boots, an old jacket, and weathered hands, then allowed those details to become an entire story. He had never asked a single honest question before reaching his conclusion. Around the lobby, employees quietly looked at one another. Some remembered how quickly they had stepped away from Marcus when the accusation was made. Others lowered their heads, realizing they had accepted the judgment simply because it came from the most powerful voice in the room. No one had intended cruelty, yet silence had allowed unfairness to grow without challenge. Richard rested one hand against the cool granite counter and drew a slow breath. The enormous company logo mounted high above the entrance reflected in the glass walls behind him, but for the first time in years it seemed smaller than the values his father had written on those aging pages. Success had built the building surrounding him. Character, his father had written, was what determined whether the building deserved to stand. Richard looked once more at Marcus, whose calm expression had never changed despite every suspicious glance directed toward him that morning. In that quiet moment, surrounded by polished stone, bright sunlight, and the watchful eyes of hundreds of employees, Richard understood that the greatest lesson his father had left behind had never been hidden inside the metal box. It had been standing patiently in front of him all along. Richard carefully folded the letter along its original creases and returned it to the envelope with hands that no longer carried the confidence of a man who believed he already understood everything around him. He looked across the lobby, noticing faces he had passed every day without truly seeing. Receptionists, custodians, security officers, interns, assistants, every one of them had quietly paused their work to witness a moment that would be remembered long after the morning ended. The polished headquarters suddenly felt less like a monument to success and more like a place waiting to rediscover its purpose. Richard slowly lifted the silver pocket watch from the box. It felt heavier than its size suggested. He pressed the small button near the crown, and the cover opened with a gentle click. Inside, the delicate hands had stopped at exactly 4:17. Beneath the crystal, engraved in tiny letters, was a sentence he had never noticed before. Time reveals what pride cannot. Richard swallowed as another memory surfaced. His father had often checked that watch before difficult conversations, not because he worried about being late, but because he believed every important decision deserved one quiet moment of reflection first. Marcus watched without interrupting. He understood that some discoveries could only happen in silence. Richard looked up slowly. You carried these things for 20 years. Did you never wonder what was inside the letter? Marcus smiled gently. Many times. Richard tilted his head. Then why did you never read it? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because trust loses its meaning the moment it becomes convenient to break. The simplicity of the answer settled over everyone listening. It was not dramatic. It was not complicated. It was simply true. Richard realized that the greatest measure of Marcus's character had never been hidden inside the envelope. It had been demonstrated every single day he chose to keep a promise no one else could have verified. An elderly facilities manager quietly stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He had worked in the building for nearly 35 years. His voice trembled slightly. Sir, I remember. Mr. Calloway Sr. bringing Mr. Bennett coffee in the maintenance garage once. We all assumed they had known each other forever. Richard turned toward him in surprise. Why did nobody ever tell me? The man offered a sad smile. We thought you already knew. Those words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Richard understood that somewhere between expanding the company, increasing profits, and protecting his reputation, he had slowly drifted away from the people who had known his father best. The distance had not appeared overnight. It had been created one overlooked conversation at a time. He looked back at Marcus. The worn jacket, the weathered boots, the calm posture, none of them appeared ordinary anymore. They reflected a lifetime built on quiet integrity rather than public recognition. Richard felt the weight of his own first words that morning return with painful clarity. He had not only mistaken Marcus for someone he was not, he had ignored everything his father had spent a lifetime trying to teach him. The realization did not arrive like a loud revelation. It settled gently, like sunlight stretching across the marble floor, impossible to stop and impossible to deny. For the first time since entering the lobby, Richard no longer saw a stranger standing before him. He saw the living proof that dignity never depends on expensive clothes, prestigious titles, or the opinions formed in a single hurried glance. Richard stood motionless for several long moments before taking a slow step toward Marcus. The distance between them had never been more than a few feet, yet it suddenly felt as though he had crossed 20 years with that single movement. The lobby remained completely silent. Employees who had witnessed negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars now found themselves watching something far more valuable than any business transaction. Richard carefully placed the pocket watch back into the metal box and closed the lid with quiet respect. Then he looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I owe you something far greater than thanks," he said, his voice steady but unmistakably humbled. "I owe you an apology." Marcus did not answer. Immediately, he simply listened. Richard continued. "The first thing I saw this morning was your jacket, your boots, the box in your hands. I never stopped long enough to see the man carrying them. I judged you before learning your name, and I repeated the very mistake my father warned me about." Every word echoed gently through the bright atrium. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered. Even the security officers stood quietly with their hands folded in front of them, their expressions softened by the sincerity of the moment. Marcus offered a warm smile that carried neither triumph nor resentment. "Your father never expected perfection from anyone," he said. "He only hoped people would be willing to learn." Richard lowered his head for a brief moment before extending his hand. "Then I hope I can begin learning today." Marcus looked at the outstretched hand, then accepted it with a firm but gentle handshake. There was no hesitation, no lingering bitterness, only quiet grace. The simple gesture seemed to release the tension that had filled the building since the morning began. Several employees smiled softly. Others blinked away unexpected emotion. Richard turned toward everyone gathered throughout the lobby. His voice carried clearly across the marble walls. "I want every person here to hear this. This morning I made a serious mistake. I allowed appearances to replace understanding. I allowed assumptions to speak before respect. That is not the culture my father built, and it will not be the culture we continue." The words settled over the crowd with unmistakable weight. Richard glanced toward the head of security. "Thank you for doing your job professionally. You acted on my instructions, not your own judgment." The officer nodded respectfully. Richard then faced the reception staff. "No one in this building should ever feel invisible because of what they wear, the work they do, or the color of their skin. We will remember that from this day forward." Marcus quietly reached for the metal box, intending to carry it away now that his promise had been fulfilled. Richard gently placed one hand over the handle. "Please leave it here for today," he said softly. "I would like everyone who walks through these doors to remember what almost happened this morning and what nearly remained unseen." Marcus nodded with quiet understanding. Sunlight reflected across the polished lid of the old box, making the worn steel shine with unexpected warmth. For the first time in 2 decades, Marcus no longer carried the weight of another man's promise. He had finally placed it exactly where it belonged, not only into Richard's hands, but into his heart. By late afternoon, the golden light streaming through the glass walls had softened, painting long reflections across the marble floor where the old metal box now rested inside a simple glass display case near the entrance. Richard had insisted that no plaque mention his own name. Instead, only a single sentence appeared beneath the weathered box. "Look beyond appearances, because character is rarely dressed to impress." Employees paused as they entered the building, reading the words before continuing toward their offices. Some smiled quietly. Others stood for a few extra seconds, remembering the morning when an ordinary-looking visitor had changed the atmosphere of the entire company without raising his voice. Marcus prepared to leave as quietly as he had arrived. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his worn jacket and thanked the receptionist for her kindness before turning toward the revolving doors. Richard caught up with him just outside the entrance. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh rain from somewhere beyond the skyline, and the American flag above the building moved gently against the bright blue sky. For a moment, neither man spoke. The noise of traffic blended with distant laughter from a nearby park, creating the peaceful rhythm of an ordinary day that somehow no longer felt ordinary at all. Richard finally broke the silence. I spent years trying to build a company my father would be proud of. Today I realized I had forgotten to build the kind of heart he hoped I would keep. Marcus smiled with the quiet warmth that had never left him. Then today was not a failure. It was a beginning. Richard nodded slowly. Will I see you again? Marcus looked toward the city streets stretching beyond the corner. Perhaps. The world has a way of bringing people together when they still have something to learn from each other. He extended his hand one final time. Richard accepted it without hesitation. The handshake felt different now. Not because Marcus had changed, but because Richard finally had. Marcus walked toward the sidewalk at an unhurried pace, disappearing into the evening crowd where expensive suits and work uniforms blended together beneath the fading sunlight. No one passing by would have guessed that the quiet man in the worn boots had carried another family's promise for 20 years without asking for recognition. Richard remained standing at the entrance long after Marcus disappeared from sight. Through the glass behind him, he could see employees stopping beside the display case before beginning their workday once again. The building looked exactly the same as it had that morning, yet everything inside felt different. Weeks later, visitors noticed a small change throughout Callaway Technologies. Executives greeted custodians by name. Managers spent time listening before making decisions. New employees were welcomed with a story about integrity instead of a presentation about profits. The company became known not only for innovation but also for respect, because one unforgettable morning reminded everyone that dignity cannot be measured by clothing, status, or first impressions. As the sun slipped below the skyline, its final rays reflected through the lobby windows and settled gently upon the old metal box. It no longer represented a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It represented one that had been kept. And in the quiet glow of the evening light, it seemed almost as though time itself had paused for just a moment, honoring two men who proved that kindness is never weakness, that humility can outlast power, and that the strongest legacy anyone can leave behind is the courage to see another human being for who they truly are.